sensible, pragmatic legislative solution to those challenging issues. We're proud to be joined by the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program and the Consumer Bankers Association in that quest this afternoon. We're also honored to feature Representative Donna Shalala. I prefer to address her as Madam Secretary, significantly because she is the longest-serving Secretary of Health and Human Services in the country's history, serving the Clinton administration in that position from 1993 to 2001. One never knows how to introduce a person with the vast experience and knowledge that Secretary Shalala has, and she's attained in her unending, seemingly inexhaustible years of public service that continue even today as representing Florida's 27th Congressional District. The 27th District is the beneficiary, but equally as important, I think the U.S. House of Representatives, and indeed the country, clearly is the beneficiary of her talents and experience. Here in the Congress, she is on what we refer to as the Speaker's Committee, the powerful House Committee on Rules, but also, and not surprising, of course, the Education and Labor Committee. I also found it appropriate that she is a member of many caucuses, but the House Peace Corps Caucus. And that's appropriate because given she actually began her career in public service as one of the country's first Peace Corps volunteers in Iran. But she also has, of course, a broad background rooted in U.S. higher education, and for over decades she served as president of the University of Miami. Previously, she was the chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as president of Hunter College. An academic by training, she earned her PhD from Syracuse University. We are also honored at BPC to say that she's been involved in some of our efforts, particularly our task force on defense personnel, as well as our various nutrition initiatives. And more importantly, from my perspective, she co-chaired the Commission on Care for Returning Wounded Warriors with one of our founders, Senator Bob Dole. The Secretary has agreed to take a few questions after her comments. Due to the lack of roving microphones, I understand, jot down any questions you have for the Secretary, pass them along, and we will try to get as many in as possible in the time allowed before the Secretary has to leave. So without further ado, Madam Secretary.
Thank you very much. See, yes, thanks. Sorry, the podium's too high for me. Actually, I was 3 inches taller before the first time I came to Washington, so I'll speak from down here, or you just see the top of my head, which may be okay. Let me make some opening remarks about what is a very important issue, not just in higher education, but for our country in general, because what happens to a generation, particularly of young people, but one of the things we have to remember is that the student debt crisis is not just focused on young people. It's focused on a lot of middle-aged people that tried to get their degrees from a wide variety of institutions. First, I want to say, because I have been in both public and private higher education, I want to say a couple of words about why we are where we are, particularly for public higher education. If you look carefully at why the costs have increased, basically, states have taken their money out of higher education. Increasingly, they have made less and less of a commitment. Now, some of their argument will be it's because of their Medicaid costs, but it's more than that. States no longer feel like higher education is at the center of their universe, and therefore their commitment to higher education has simply not kept up with costs. And as a result, the costs have shifted onto tuition and onto parents to pick up a larger and larger share of the cost of higher education. Second is the introduction of for-profit colleges into the higher education space, particularly eating up the big increase in Pell Grant. Convinced they had 1 year of an expensive tuition for a private university, which was my own, and I convinced them that they ought to go to the public community college which would provide them very good training and then transfer to the University of Miami and save 2 years of very high tuition. Both they and their families, often new immigrants, were certainly going to be better off if they did that, and they would still end up with the University of Miami degree. This was particularly true for students who, for one reason or another, were not eligible for scholarships. The third point is that universities, particularly the privates, discount their rates very dramatically. Looking at just the tuition of institutions isn't good enough. You have to look at their discount rates. And most of the private colleges, particularly those without large endowments, are discounting almost at least 50%. So very few people are actually paying the actual cost of higher education. But that leaves us with large student loans, and with an understanding that undergraduates are paying 28% more for college on average than they did a decade ago, and 65% more than they did 20 years ago. We used to have a joke at all the institutions that I was at that higher education becomes so expensive that none of us could have afforded to go full-time. Literally, the top echelon of our institutions, none of us could have gone full-time to school. We would have had to do work much more. And finally, let me say that one of the nice things about the report that everybody is working on here is it makes it very clear that the vast majority of students in higher education are working students, that they're not at traditional four-year colleges. The problem with federal policy is that almost all of it is focused on traditional schools. It has not been nimble enough or responsive enough to understand what's really happening in higher education. I tell the story of sitting in a governor's office, must have been 20 years ago, when I was secretary of HHS, and I was waiting to talk to him. He was on the phone with the legislative leader, and he was saying to the legislative leader, listen, we got to cut off aid after 5 years for all of the students in our higher education. And I literally walked up to him and tapped him on the shoulder and asked him to put the phone on hold while I lectured him on what the real students in his state were about. And he got back on the phone and he said, well, maybe not 5 years, he said. He said, I've got someone in my office that thinks we ought to look very carefully at who our students are in the state. It always occurred to me that I probably saved thousands of students in that state from getting their financial aid cut off, because he had an image in his head of if kids didn't finish in 5 years, you know, they were just hanging around and eating up state money, as opposed to understanding that the vast majority of students in this country are working and going to school. It's going to take them much longer. It also means that universities have to be organized for that. When I first got early in my career, when I was in my 30s, when I became president of Hunter College, I convinced the faculty, in exchange for things like private offices, that we had to teach from 7:30 in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. And the reason for that is that we had working students in the middle of New York City. And I convinced them that we should offer degrees in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, and that we should organize ourselves for that because of the working schedules of our students, that we had to be far more responsive. The problem is that most of the leaders in higher education have come out of traditional four-year colleges. They're not working class. They're not thinking about the students that they have. They didn't spend years trying to get their degrees. And they have this image in their heads of a traditional school. And because of that, and because of their impact on higher education, and their impact on federal policy, we're just starting to seriously consider these issues in higher education. And we've gotten ourselves into a bind with very high loans, in my judgment. Debt that students literally will have a struggle. So we've started to introduce bills to help students cut down on those loans. One of the bills we've introduced is monthly payment based on the amount of loans that they take out. That's full transparency. What are you going to have to pay when you graduate if you take out a certain amount of loans? And hopefully all of us will understand that transparency is essential to making informed decisions for a lifetime. I sat on one of the biggest homeowners, actually it was a home builders board, and in which the CEO actually wanted to incorporate student loans into the mortgage, which was an interesting and creative idea. And the reason he wanted to do that is because the mortgages were lower than the student loans, and students that had big student loans couldn't buy houses. So it was self-interest as well as an attempt to try to figure out how to do that. But you try to talk to Fannie Mae about how much you can incorporate into a mortgage, because everybody is living in their silos. Those kinds of creative solutions where we bundle the payments is also something that we ought to be looking at. We can't solve this crisis overnight, but to solve it, we have to understand it. We have to understand who our clients are and who these students are, what their age distribution is, what kinds of institutions they're going to, and hold those institutions accountable in the years ahead. Congress can help, and it clearly is since we give the loans out, it clearly is a federal responsibility, but it also has a lot to do with the future of the country. Because if you talk to people the way I do, where their lives are stunted, their ability to buy homes, their ability to change jobs, their ability to get other kinds of loans because they have the student loan debt for years and years, then you understand that whatever we do is an investment in the future of the country. Thank you very much, Bill, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
I'm going to make an executive decision here. It's a small enough room. If you have a question, just raise your hand and shout it out so we can.
You don't have to shout very loud. I teach a class this large.
Any questions for the Secretary? I'll start it off, Madam Secretary. Given Higher Education Reauthorization Act is up this year, what's your prognosis here in the House and in the Senate?
Well, in the House, I think we'd like to do something very comprehensive. Chairman Scott would like to do a number of things. We certainly will focus on student debt. There's no question about that. In the Senate, I actually went over and had lunch with Senator Alexander, who I've known for many years. And I think he wants to do a more limited bill. But he has a very good relationship with Patty Murray, with the vice chair, the ranking member, Patty Murray. So I think we're going to be able to work something out. This is another area that clearly can be bipartisan. So I think we have a shot at working something out, and particularly in the student debt area. There are some other issues in higher education, sexual harassment, those issues where we're having some struggle with the secretary. But on student debt in particular, I think there's consensus we have to do something.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I'm Lamont Jones from Diverse Issues in Higher Education magazine. I have a question about student loan discharge. Senator Warren has, during the Democratic nomination, has recommended or has proposed out is looking at the possibility of discharge up to a certain amount. What are your views on discharge regarding the prospect?
I assume her use of the word discharge is that we write off a certain amount of money. I think that the combination of public service as a way of doing that, I think I can sell to my constituents if people do something for that to occur. And public service is one way of doing it. But I've never believed in this 10-year business. 10 years is a lifetime. I can't tell you. 10 years I was in the Peace Corps, I was in graduate school, and I got tenure by that time, I think. And that's a long time. That, for me, was a lifetime. Though now, looking back, it doesn't seem like it was a long period of time. So I think that if we reduce the number of years to 5 years, that, in fact, is an opportunity for us to do it. I also want to hold interest. Yeah, her parents did, though. Listen, I had student loans. I had $25,000 in student loans.
Right, so the broader question, we could help her, but what's the role of formal work counseling
I,
at the high school level? For
Yeah.
families?
yeah, it's not only counseling at the high school level, it's counseling at the college level. College financial aid has to be more than mechanical. And that's why the transparency of what it's actually going to cost you when you graduate if you borrow this amount of money, what the interest rate is. I have a cousin that actually, he was so smart, he just kept paying the interest while he was in college. So he actually just had the core of the loan, and that hadn't accumulated for him. But I don't know anyone else that did what he did. He's making a lot of money now. He was obviously a smart finance major. But that's the importance of both transparency and making judgments about what the family can afford. And it used to be that we could work during the summer and pay our tuition for the next semester. You know how old I am when I say things like that. But you can't do that anymore. You're lucky if you can make enough for your spending money during the year. So we just have to have more information to parents and to the kids. And it's the responsibility of both higher education and the parents and the young person.
We have time for about one more question.
There's one back there.
Justin Ham with Navient. I just had a question about what do you think the best way to go about, college accountability? What would the best way to go about that? Do you like income shared agreements? Do you think it's providing more information on students after they graduate and what they're making, things of that nature? What do you think would be the best way to go about college accountability?
First of all, colleges, because they want their graduation rates to be up, have some interest in making sure that they have packages for their students. Most colleges. Not just because of the ranking system, because that's the standard, the gold standard for an institution to get their students through. So that there is some incentive there. But it's the transparency of the loans and the real cost of college that is not just the tuition and the room and board, but the other out-of-pocket costs. And they look like, and families' ability to plan. But I've dealt with families my whole career who were not English speaking, in which the parents needed help filling out the FAFSA proposals. So it's everybody combined has to take some responsibility to make sure we're producing a generation of people that can actually move on in their careers and move into the middle class and not overly burdened with the cost of higher education. So it's 5,000 elements from my point of view. It's not a single one. It's not writing off the debt. It's not. It's everybody taking responsibility.
Thank you, Madam Secretary.
You're welcome.
And thank you for your service, long service to the country, and your continued service.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
We have a panel now. We'll set up the panel, and I will start it off. When I was at CBO, issues in designing a federal program of income contingent student loans. This is 1970 or 1994 going forward. So it's not a new issue that's been around. So I look forward. The first panel here will focus on those designed and better support issues. Moderating the discussion is Catherine Lucas McKay. She's the program manager at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program, and she'll introduce the panelists. And thank you very much, panelists, for your participation. Thank you. Go ahead, Catherine.
Thank you. There we go. Good. All right. Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm really excited to see this full house here today because this is such an important issue. As mentioned, I am a program manager at the Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program. For those of you who don't know Aspen, we are a think tank, but one with a rather unique place in the DC policy ecosystem in that we are really organized around the idea of dialogue and equipping leaders to take action to make the changes that they want to see in the world. We bring together diverse voices and have the conversations that are often difficult to have or that people simply are having around tables not with each other. We also try to translate research and new policy developments that are coming out of all different sectors, whether that is nonprofits, advocates, academia, or policy proposals and legislation. We also, as I said, do our best to equip leaders with the tools that they need to make the changes that they want to see. And for the financial security program, what that means is developing strategies and identifying opportunities for leaders, whether they are in financial services, the nonprofit sector and advocates, and policymakers to actually operationalize things that would improve the financial security of millions of US households. So we are here today. My fellow panelists are Julie Margetta Morgan from the Roosevelt Institute, Tiffany Jones from the Education Trust, and Jeff Andrade from the McKeon Group. We are, in true Aspen fashion, a group of diverse voices and perspectives, and we are looking forward to having a conversation that is focused on the needs of the 45 million borrowers who have student loans today. We heard that it is a $1.5 trillion aggregate balance, and more than 90% of that is either owned by or guaranteed by the US government. That makes the Department of Education the largest lender in America, which is kind of shocking given that their mission is to ensure that children and young people have the education that they need to succeed in the world, not to manage a $1.5 trillion portfolio. That $1.5 trillion breaks down into a median loan amount of $19,000. About 75% of people who are enrolling today borrow to fund their education. So while right now only 1 in 4 households has student loans, we expect that number to creep up over time. More than 11% of student loans are in default, which adds up to hundreds of millions of dollars. That is a problem that's difficult to ignore and is one of the issues that really drove in the last 2 years, as our program was researching consumer debt, the broad-based concern that we heard from experts. But as we were talking to consumers through focus groups and relationships with our partners, what we heard was more, it's not just a default problem, it's also a problem of managing this on a day-to-day basis, worrying about being a parent who's managing their student loans, looking towards their kids' education and not sure how they're going to take on more. And beyond that, the idea of seeing their balances just grow over time and how overwhelming and dispiriting that was. So our perspective is that there are real problems in the student loan sector. And the conversation that we're going to have takes that as the founding premise and explores to what degree is this problem a serious and urgent one? For whom is it a serious and urgent problem? And what do those facts tell us about what we should do about it? What are the reforms that are truly necessary for us to take on at this moment in time? So, to get us started, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to take about 2 minutes to tell us about their experience working on student loans throughout
their white counterparts. So I think just as important is to understand how we got to where we are. So a lot of the rhetoric, again, focuses on the college wage premium that people earn more over their lifetime with a college degree. So we hear that, you'll earn $1 million more over your lifetime. Our work takes a look at not just that premium, but what drives it. And so when we look at that, we can see the falling wages for people with a high school diploma. So instead of saying college is a great opportunity in the lived experience of students, it's I can't afford to go to college, but I can't afford not to go to college because I'll end up in poverty. And I think we really need to pay attention to the message that's been sent by our government and also by the businesses to whom our government often listens on these things. So our government and private business told us that there's a skills gap and that we need you to go to school. We need this for the competitiveness of our economy, but also it's going to benefit you. I think, it's interesting in that context that we didn't say we need this for our economy and therefore we'll pay for it. Instead, we said we need this for our economy and you ought to fund it yourself. It'll pay off down the line. So our research shows that this is wrong. Those credentials were not rewarded on the whole in the labor market, and the debt that students took on over time was not justified. So the question for me is, who should pay for this failed policy experiment? And I would argue that we all ought to pay for it because we all were complicit in creating it. And so I think we ought to look at solutions like student debt cancellation, which is mentioned in the keynote. And I also think it's key to point out that even in the context of free college and debt cancellation, we ought to be looking very seriously at regulating the student loan industry. We need to crack down on accountability within the federal student loan program, but also what sometimes gets left out of the conversation is the private student loan industry. So I think it was really heartening to see policymakers in the last couple of weeks focusing on bankruptcy. We need to look at bankruptcy and far beyond that to regulating even the new and upcoming subprime borrowing that we'll see in the income share agreement industry.
Great. And we will talk much more about solution strategies as we go forward too.
Good afternoon. So I would definitely start off by saying a 5. And part of how we got here as the Education Trust is we advocate for low-income students and students of color for educational opportunities across the pipeline from early education through higher ed. Traditionally, we hadn't been as focused on student debt besides our interest in consumer protections for students who attend for-profit colleges and universities, and the intersection between student debt and, of course, increasing completion overall in higher ed. But increasingly, as folks like Julie and others across the field, some of which are in this room, produced research that demonstrated that for the students we focus on, in particular, low-income students and students of color, there's a particular crisis that we couldn't ignore and wanted to make sure that all of our advocacy efforts were being used to help push solutions that would make a difference for these students. So for those reasons, I would say it's a 5. And to Julie's point, share in the thinking that if we're going to require post-secondary degree or credential for students to earn a livable wage, that degree or credential ought to be affordable. And that's why we're here today, because it's not. And so as it was alluded to earlier, you can no longer work your way through college. And in fact, a great illustration of this I found on a really important resource. If you aren't tapped in, make sure you're on Twitter, because on Twitter, the great Susan Donarski tweeted over the weekend, in 1968, you could earn a year of tuition at University of North Carolina by working 220 hours at minimum wage. But today, in 2019, it would take over 1,200 hours at minimum wage to be able to pay for that 1 year of tuition at the same institution, as a great illustration of it's no longer possible for you to work your way through college. And as a result, students are taking on debt to pay. And if students could afford this debt and repay it back with ease, we wouldn't be in this room today, but they aren't. 1 in 10 students end up defaulting on their student loans, and default is the most egregious situation, but we understand that those who are making payments every single month on time are still struggling. And so repayment rates tell us a little bit about what's happening there. And so about a third of students had not paid down at least $1 on their principal after 5 got here, and all of the discriminatory systems in education, in lending, housing, et cetera, that impact both the resources that they have as they attend college and figure out how to pay, and afterwards when they're figuring out how to repay their loans. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, it's great to be here. My name's Jeff Andrade. I work for the McKeon Group, which was founded by former chairman of the House Education and then Workforce Committee, Buck McKeon. Chairman McKeon's also co-chairing he's a Republican co-chair of BPC's Higher Education Task Force. And I guess first and foremost, my experience here is as a student loan survivor. And I think each generation thinks that they have it worse than others. And if we're going to be sort of, exchanging tales of, who's had it worse, I came in at it basically at an institution that costs more than our family income in 1 year. A situation where student tuition increases went up nearly 50% over the 4 years. And we did it at 9% interest rates, and we're the first to have loan origination fees. But I can tell you, despite all that, you can actually pay back your loans in full and not default. And I think part of what student loans get a bad rap, student loans can be a very effective tool because what you are doing is you are essentially borrowing against future income, and I don't think we look at that enough. And you're borrowing against future income, and you're using it with tomorrow's dollars. So it's actually in some ways a better option than saving, almost a better option than working through. But there's a couple of caveats I think that you have to have when you're looking at this. And one is the key is to try to get through school as quickly as possible. Every month that a student stays in school from a living expense standpoint costs them an additional $2,000. You have the inflationary $2,000 a month. Excuse me. You have the inflationary impact of tuition prices keep going up each year, and then you also have lost income. For the average, graduate coming out at $48,000 a year, that's $4,000 a month. And then you have the effects of interest capitalization. And if you capitalize your interest while you're in school for 4 years and you had the 6.8% loans, that's roughly going to add 18% to your balance. So there's a lot of factors, and we were actually pleased to see a number of changes in the Prosper Act that was introduced in the last Congress that pushed students to complete quicker. So in terms of a crisis, I would put it actually as a 2.5. I think for most students, they have interest rates and payments that are within generally acceptable limits. If you look at undergraduates, you're looking at roughly $30,000. That translates into about a $323 a month payment. The places where the two key places where I see stress in the system is the proliferation of graduate students and the amount of debt that they've incurred versus the return on investment that they're likely to get out of that education, and those who do not complete education, who I think are being pursued for loan amounts that are vastly greater than the market value of those loans if they were to be sold as outright debt.
All right, thank you. So I want to just dig in a little bit to what is the experience like of carrying these loans, trying to manage them, paying them off, navigating the 10 repayment plan options that federal borrowers have. So Julie, I'm going to throw that to you. And then Tiffany, if you could share a little bit more about how that managing the loans experience differs for lower income borrowers and borrowers of color.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think it takes me back to a little bit of what Jeff said, which pushes one of my buttons. So let's talk about it. This idea of generally acceptable limits on how much money people take on. The data that we collect on student loans
that research suggests actually move students the most in terms of social mobility. It's a bachelor's degree, so we'd assume that these students, if they want to get the most out of earning a post-secondary degree, would be able to afford a bachelor's degree. But again, students are already borrowing just to get the 2-year degree. So I think that's important context as well. And just thinking about the fact that they have less support in terms of being able to rely on family members to help them repay their loans. And so I spent a bit of time talking about this population of folks with some college, no degree. In fact, about a fifth of all adults have some sort of college degree, or I'm sorry, some college credits, but no degree. And so there's been some discussion about how do you re-engage these folks in higher ed so they can come back, earn their degree, and have more success in the job market. And so just to highlight a kind of a promising way of thinking and some work that Wayne State University is doing in particular to try to re-engage some of these adults with some college no degree, and their location in downtown Detroit being able to tap into the high population of low-income Black adults there. There's a commitment to forgive some of their loans and help them repay the loans that they have as part of the agreement for them to re-engage and re-enroll. In fact, they built it out so that it's incentivized around them persisting. So if they persist to the next semester, they'll get more debt forgiven, and then the next. And so I think these are promising models to figure out how to re-engage these folks, because otherwise they have these competing priorities where they are trying to figure out how to repay their loans and all of the other financial responsibilities that they have, when we know that them eventually earning their post-secondary degree or credential is important. So the good news is that there are other universities specifically in that area who've jumped on board as well and hoping to expand that program. But I think ideas like that have to be a part of our thinking in terms of figuring out how to make sure that these folks that have some college and no degree are able to earn their degree so they can actually have a greater likelihood that they'll be able to repay their loans. Because those without the college degree who dropped out default at almost twice the rate as those who actually complete their degree.
Can I
Quick
what Tiffany was saying just inspired me to think about, I feel like I didn't fully answer your question on the borrowers who are struggling to repay and their options. I just want to talk about bankruptcy for one more minute. Despite the fact that on virtually every other type of expense, a person can file for bankruptcy and receive some protection from those debts, we have removed those protections not only for federal student loans, but also for private student loans. It's extremely difficult for a borrower to discharge their student loan in bankruptcy. There's even been some reports that on loans that ought to be discharged in bankruptcy, the lenders are hiding that fact from the borrowers. Just in terms of what that experience looks like for a borrower, we have reports of the Department of Education going through people's receipts showing, look, you spent money on fast food this month and therefore you ought to be able to repay your loan. We are making it, not only does the law make it unnecessarily hard, but the way that our government and the other lenders interpret the law and fight tooth and nail against people who very obviously can't repay their debts is, in my mind, unjust.
So, Jeff, looks like you may have a response there, and feel free to, but I also want to just pitch my next question, which is for you. You have deep expertise on the policymaking side, both on the Hill and working for the Department of Education. And from that different perspective and viewpoint, what are the pain points in the student loan disbursement and management systems that contribute to these problems or that contribute to other problems around the program?
Yeah, a lot of the problems that I see that we have now are stemming from the takeover 10 years ago of the student loan program by the federal government. So, for example, interest rates. Interest rates, there used to be price competition in the FEL program between lenders, and interest rates tend to be on the shorter end of the yield curve, meaning that historically they were lower. And so one of the constraints you have now in the current system is it would cost the federal government billions of dollars to lower interest rates below where they currently are. The other thing is I think, overuse and abuse of the income-based repayment options. Not only are they confusing for borrowers, and I have
About reform options.
Yeah, I would just say, I agree that I think there's are some problems with our reliance on income-based repayment as well. I think my sense is that the need for income-based repayment is a symptom of the larger problem, which is the failure of student loans as a policy for financing higher education. And so my problem with income-based repayment is essentially that instead of us taking care of this problem as a country, we're sort of like benevolently mitigating it by asking people to pay less of their income over a longer period of time. I think it's the wrong way to approach it. But the idea that we did this better under the FEL system or that private lenders do this better, I think just is not supported by the evidence.
Well, I would disagree because we didn't have a situation of negative amortization like we do now. And that is the big part of the problem. And in fact, the government has an incentive to keep people in longer. And if you look at these proposals, and one of the reasons why you have the 10-year rule, for example, was because it pushed the loan forgiveness out of the budget window when they were originally passing it.
What's the government's incentive?
We actually need to
Oh, okay.
move on to reform options, but
Yeah.
I believe it is around like earning more interest income over time if you're not forgiving it. So we have heard many, many great, newsworthy, and also wonky technical proposals around what to do here. A lot of them, it was really refreshing as a policy researcher to see an area with like broad bipartisan engagement these days. It does not happen as often as you might want, but doing something about income-driven repayment plans seems to be one of those areas. There's also, as we mentioned, proposals around dealing with interest rates and refinancing, canceling student loans, discharging student loans under specific circumstances, particularly around people who went to private colleges. So given all of those options, and I'd be remiss to say that outside on that table is an executive summary of a recent Aspen report on what many of those options look like, as well as some of our colleagues' work on that subject. What are some of these strategies that you think would best address the problems that we've identified as we've had this conversation?
I'll jump in there with a couple thoughts. I think one, I've talked quite a bit about the completion crisis and the relationship between those being able to complete and earn their degree, having more success repaying their loans. And so I think it's important for the federal government to take a more substantial role in ensuring that students are having access to high quality degrees and increased likelihood that they'll complete. So one part of that is maintaining and strengthening existing provisions that are in place, like the 90-10 rule and gainful employment, which are designed to ensure that there's a better return on investment for students. But I think there's a lot more that can be done, and in building a comprehensive system that would hold campuses accountable, not just for completion rates, which would be a really important part, but also their commitment to enrolling low-income students and students of color as well. This system would also provide additional resources for the campuses that are committed to serving these students, like community colleges, like historically Black colleges and others that have been under-resourced over time, so that they can use these additional resources to implement strategies that evidence suggests actually support the likelihood that students will complete. And then also, after you've done that and given folks time, then enforcing meaningful consequences around whether or not that they've made improvement. But I think there has to be an active role for the federal government in improving completion in higher ed, but remembering completion doesn't solve it all, and that, Black students who complete their bachelor's degree struggle to repay even more so than white students who don't. And so if it's going to be a massive, debt cancellation or some other proposal, just keeping in mind when you're setting limits around who to target based on who you assume struggles the most to take into consideration wealth alongside income, because you might miss a lot of struggling Black borrowers who might be above the income threshold but have significantly less wealth. And then also considering the role of student debt in exploratory conversations that have been proposed around reparations, because the wealth gap is directly related to the legacy of slavery and racially discriminatory policies in education, housing, and private market lending, et cetera. So if we're going to have a commission, as some is proposed around reparations, talking about student debt cancellation as a vehicle should be a part of the conversation as well. And the last thing I'll say around solutions is the best thing we can do is increase need-based
Loss of attendance, particularly at private nonprofit institutions. We would be heading in a good direction in that way, because I think right now we are wasting a lot of money on people who never complete, and we're also in many cases ruining the financial lives of people through loans as a result of their participation in the system.
We are going to transition to Q&A in just a moment, but Julie, I want to give you a chance for a last word as well.
Yeah, I think we need to think about the front end and the back end, what's going to happen for future students and what we want to do for students with existing debt. On the front end, I think we need to think big. In other spaces like the healthcare space, we talk a lot about what a public option looks like. In higher education, I think we need to take that seriously. We have public institutions, but we don't treat them as public institutions. We don't invest in them the way that we ought to, and we also don't think about, whether or not they actually are serving public purposes. So I think we need to really rethink both how we invest in those schools and also what we make of them. And then on the back end, I think, like I said earlier, I'm really pleased to see that we're having a serious debate about debt cancellation. As Tiffany said, there are a lot of different ways to think about how we target debt cancellation, but it's so important to coming up with a solution to the student debt crisis. And then moving forward, like I said, even in a world of free college, even in a world where we cancel existing debt, the student debt program will live on, as will the private industry, and so we really need to take regulating those seriously.
All right, thank you. I think it worked out pretty well for us to stand up and loudly ask our questions. We've got about 9 minutes for that, so let's make sure that they are questions, but I will call on you as you raise your hands. Over there, yes.
So to play off of Representative Shalala's suggestion of greater visibility, what if we included her part of telling students up front, this is what your student loan repayment will look like if you take this much money out. But also when they enter a school to say, here's the likelihood of finishing at this school within 100% of the time of the degree or 150%. So you have that probability of finishing. And also what your expected income will be if you major in this major or if you major in this major, for example, an AA in liberal arts, whatever. Then people can see, hey, how likely am I to graduate and how do my loan repayments compare to what I'm likely to earn next year?
Okay. Yeah, I think the problem in transparency are the numerous options that we currently have. So I think, if Congresswoman Shalala's bill were to become law, it would probably be about a 15-page disclosure with a whole bunch of different numbers and what ifs. But I think we do need more transparency, and I'm someone who supports matching how much you borrow to the expected earnings. And I think you see, what you major in determines, your income more than your school. And so I think, people who are in engineering, STEM, they have the capacity to borrow more. People that are going into early childhood education, divinity studies, they're on the lower end. And I think that needs to be in mind. And I don't know if that's counseling. I know a lot of the schools that I would work with, would have concerns about possible, misrepresentation liability if they were to put that out. And they're very cagey about putting the statistics out. They'll point to you and they'll say statistics are here based on, with the Department of Labor, but they won't get into the specifics. But I think it's very important to match how much you borrow versus how much you can potentially earn.
Look, I think there's always more that people could know about their student loans, and the more complicated we make the program, the more there is to know, right? But this, it's kind of striking, I think, to be talking about consumer information now, because when Representative McKeon was, right, when we did the college, what was it called? The College Cost and Opportunity Act? Anyway, in 2007, there was a huge emphasis on consumer information. We tried to educate our way out of our country's affordability problem, and it didn't work. I think we ended up with 85 different watch lists for
about low-income students in particular, because they're making 2 years of community college free, but to be thinking about those costs beyond tuition. for those students, because again, when they don't have those non-tuition costs covered, that's where they're borrowing. And the challenge we're seeing is that in some states, as they're spending more money on something like free college, which might provide some benefit to students who are upper income and can afford college tuition, they are not fully funding their need-based aid programs. So that means there's low-income students who are not getting what they need while states are spending money on upper-income students. So we would encourage states not to do that, to fully fund their need-based aid programs. And then when they're thinking about how they give out money to the institutions, they most often give the most money to colleges in their state that are more selective, that already have more resources that can be spent on helping students pay. So that means part of the reason that some of these colleges, like community colleges and open access four-year colleges, where they have higher, their completion rates are lower. Part of the issue is that they have more low-income students and they have fewer resources to support those students, or to even give them, more resources to pay for college, much less the support services that they need. So states can do something about that. They can change how they give out those dollars so that they're not spending the most money on the colleges and universities that already have the most, that are also serving the students that have the most, if that makes sense.
I want to jump in on that too. A lot of what I'm seeing in terms of these federal-state partnerships is actually a very thinly veiled attempt to lock states into a federal maintenance of effort requirement for state spending. I think those on the left and people at the public institutions see sort of the demographic of the traditional traditional student population coming down the pike and see a dip, and they want to maintain their current levels of funding. So I think we already have federal state partnerships in terms of it's a state responsibility to run community colleges and public universities, as well as need-based grant, and they layer that on top of a base of federal support. So I'm not sure, other than putting a maintenance of effort requirement, what you're really going to see come out of these federal-state partnership proposals.
I think we should be paying a lot of attention to federal-state partnerships. I think, when you look at the scale of the problem, and if you look at the goal of helping students in the U.S., regardless of which state they live in, we're going to need a federal investment here. I think it's fair to ask questions about what kinds of requirements we're going to put on states in those circumstances. But I think my fear is less that we're going to end up with just maintenance of effort and more that we're going to end up with money going into states without real change for actual students. So it's a conversation that deserves a lot of attention.
Well, thank you all so much. Our next conversation in just a moment here is going to focus on, all right, we've got these 45 million borrowers out there today, but what about our next generation? Our conversation touched on that in a number of ways, and we're going to explore it much more deeply. As a closing word, I would say, as confusing as all of the options around repayment are, and as tough as it can be both as a government to administer and as a borrower to navigate, figuring out what to do is just as complicated a conversation, and I would really encourage you all to check out not just Aspen's work on that, but also everyone up here and those on the next panel who work on loans as well. Thank you so much.
This is me, right? Yeah. How do I turn this on?
All right, thanks, folks. We're going to roll right into our next panel now. As I mentioned, this one focuses on addressing issues with financing higher education. This will be moderated by Kenny Morgan, our colleague at the Bipartisan Policy Center. He will offer a few quick opening remarks, introduce our other panelists, and we will get underway.
Million, I believe, in 2000, or sorry, 600 billion in 2006. So we've seen almost $1 trillion increase in the last decade. Doug, what's driving these trends?
Well, first,
Thank you so much for having me. There's, I think, two kind of big things. One is, of course, the cost, the price of college has gone up considerably, and there's many reasons that this has happened, and those reasons differ across sector. That state divestment certainly plays a part among public institutions, among selective privates. You're looking at maybe competition and trying to move up the U.S. News rankings. I think Baumol's cost disease, just kind of the notion that this sector relies heavily on labor inputs, and as long as that keeps being the case, it's when you're talking about highly educated labor that's gotten more expensive over time, that cost is going to be borne by colleges. So that's a big part of it. College costs more to attend. But then there's also that over the last several decades, colleges are educating a very different student than they were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. That it tends to be older students, a more diverse population, and this is wonderful. But there's tends to be fewer scholarships, and much of higher education is kind of stuck in the past in terms of funding the quote unquote traditional college student out of high school, and there's less aid available for what is the current student being educated, and so that that leads to more debt as well.
Do other panelists have any additional causes of the student debt portfolio, or do you agree with Doug?
So one thing that we, look at is the New York Federal Reserve has come out with a study that says for every dollar of federal student aid, that can drive tuition prices up to at most 63 cents on that dollar. So I think the availability of federal funds is certainly something that also contributes to the increase in tuition prices.
So this is a really interesting point here. On the one hand, we've got increasing debt, which is caused by just rising tuition prices. But on the other hand, there's an argument that increased loan availability is actually driving up prices. Is it a combination of these two factors, or is one stronger than the other? Do we not know?
I'll let other people go first.
I mean, there's been a sense for a long time now, and Education Secretary Bennett was the one who articulated this idea of a Bennett hypothesis, that it was the introduction of federal aid that has inflated tuition prices, and there's actually very little evidence, in the ways that it's been looked at. So we know it's not really true for Pell. It looks slightly true for Pell when it comes to for-profit institutions. We also know that not a lot has been explored with the PLUS loan program. So student loans, especially at the undergraduate level, come with very strict annual lending limits and lifetime limits. But there are two programs in the federal portfolio that are basically unlimited loans, up to the full cost of attendance with no aggregate limits. And one is a loan program that is for undergraduate students who are dependent students, and it's made to their parents. So their parents are responsible for paying these loans back. And the other program is the Graduate Plus Loan Program. So this is really what has enabled graduate students to borrow unlimited amounts of money. And I think there, with this sort of unlimited money, I think the question of is it pushing tuitions up might be a little bit, might be muddying the waters a bit. But Doug would certainly know much better than I do.
Yeah, I'll just add, I agree with Rachel. I think it's just not clear enough from the data either way, but I think what is clear is that the way we are doing student loans in this country is not working, and it's not working for a large sector of our population, particularly people of color and low-income students. So I think focusing on that kind of masks the real question of the issue. Really just decreased since the program started. So we can drastically start by doubling the Pell Grant immediately, make it easier for people to fill out the FAFSA and actually access the Pell Grant, make it so that, if you already are participating in federal means-tested programs, we know that you automatically qualify for the Pell Grant, streamline the requirements. Also, UNCF, we always advocate that you support the schools that best serve low-income students and students of color already, and that is historically black colleges and universities and other MSIs. We take on a lion's share of educating and doing it well students that other institutions don't serve well. 70% of our students are Pell Grant eligible, 80% are African American, and we only represent 3% of all higher ed institutions, but we produce 17% of black graduates, 24% of black graduates in the STEM fields. And yet we have been historically underinvested in and undervalued at both the state and federal level. So if we want to really help students of color and low-income students, let's start here as well. Let's drastically increase the investment, not just in Pell Grants, but in the funding for HBCUs and MSIs.
One thing I'd say that's partially in response to the statement a moment ago about the lessening reliance on the federal loan program and more on the private markets. So much of higher education, I think it should better be thought of as, from a risk-return perspective, that on average, college is worth it. But there is, a lot of my work is focused on, the downside risk, that even if it's true that for the average person that you're going to, receive earnings that are commensurate with your debt, the downside risk is absolutely there. And that's a really important thing and an avenue that the federal government has, can play a really important role in, that, acting as a safety net, that private student loans, they don't have the safety net of something like income-based repayment. And as long as that's true, I think there really, needs to be a, continued role for, for the federal government, for, everyone, in terms of the loan program.
Can I respond?
Absolutely.
So again, there's a role for the federal government. It's to help those most in need. We believe that we're serving our borrowers extremely well with a 98% repayment rate. I think it speaks for itself. In terms of income-based repayment, I think that is an option on the federal program that should be targeted. It should be utilized for those in certain circumstances. Today, unfortunately, it's becoming the default. We've got over 50% of today's borrowers in income-based repayment. Only less than a quarter of those borrowers are actually paying down their loans today. So you've got about 75% of borrowers today who are paying $0 towards their federal student loan. So at the end of this income-based repayment program at 20 years or 25, depending on which of the programs you're in, we're going to offer borrowers forgiveness. So we're already seeing the tide start to change. We've seen a new CBO report saying that federal loans are now going to cost $31 billion over the next 10 years. That number's only going to increase at this rate. So I think IBR can be a good solution for a slim, portion of borrowers, but today it's being misused. So we've got to start thinking critically about how to set up borrowers for success. And I think a key piece of that is making sure that they don't overborrow. And I think you can improve it through loan disclosures. That's something that private student loans do very well at 3 times throughout the loan process. We're going to provide a very clear disclosure about what your loan costs are, what your monthly payment's going to be. Today, the federal government gives you dozens of pages of fine print and none of it's specific to you. So we're setting up borrowers for failure. And then just lastly, I think the PLUS loan programs, and I know Rachel's done a lot of work in this space. Today, so many borrowers are utilizing Parent Plus and Graduate Plus loans, and the outcomes are not great. We've seen huge enrollment in those programs, and I think that's really driving a lot of the loan balance increases. And those, there's no borrowing limit, really, except for the cost of attendance that a college or institution gets.
Degree, I'll be more competitive in the workforce, but I'm spending another year in school. I have less to cover it because all of a sudden the Pell Grant's gone away. But it's okay because I can borrow Grad Plus loans and I know I can pay through income-driven repayment. So overall, we know the more education you have, especially if you have a bachelor's degree and above, which each level, you get more of a return on investment in the data. But we don't really know what that looks like in the sense of giving, so it gives institutions a pass, right? Like if they're cross-subsidizing with these master's programs, it kind of gives institutions a pass while people are borrowing lots of money. And maybe they're not struggling to repay it as much as somebody who's only got an associate's degree or didn't achieve an associate's degree at all. We know the majority of struggling borrowers are struggling with $10,000 or less, not like the $100,000 borrower, but that's not to say that there's not some struggle going on. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about the high enrollment and income-driven repayment for graduate students and be calling for graduate outcomes.
So one thing that I'd say, just to start it off, I do think that, I'd say this is someone with a graduate degree who, teaches in our graduate program. I do think that there's, too many people going to graduate school in this country, that just relative to what the labor market can bear. Now, I really want to push back on this notion that people are abusing something like income-driven repayment. That if you are now, I do think that there should be some reforms in how the formulas, not to get too wonky, but I think at the bottom end of income-driven repayment, I think it needs to be a little bit more progressive. At the top end, I think that there are, just because of the age earnings distribution and when people are earning money, and I think that there's too many people who are right now in line for forgiveness under IDR, but who are actually higher income people and will I think the formula absolutely should be tweaked, but and there are easy ways to do this, but I don't think that this is an issue of blame for the students in terms of misuse of IDR. If you're not making any payments under IDR right now, under on your student loans, then I think that suggests a role for accountability, that you did not get the return that you thought. And this is not I don't think this is something that should be placed on students. I think this is something that we need to be tightening our accountability programs across all sectors, not just certainly people talk a lot about for-profit. I think I've done a lot of work and talked countless hours with Kenny here about ways that we can up our accountability, but that's to me, if there's that many people, and there are, that are not making progress on their loans, I don't want to put that on the students here.
I just want to add, I agree with a lot of what Doug said, and I think it also goes back to something that was mentioned on the last panel. IDR also currently doesn't adequately account for the difference between income and wealth, and how just because you make a certain amount of money a year doesn't mean you're actually able to do certain things that you would expect someone to do making that certain amount of money, because they have a different wealth background than someone else. And we know that wealth is also directly related to the historical context of this country, race, everything. So we can't just say there's a problem with IDR and the way we do IDR and the students that are using IDR. It's more than that, and it's all connected to the bigger picture. Is that a fire drill?
I think so.
We're having a fire drill for those tuning in. We're on a fire drill for the folks tuning in online, so we apologize.